Namaste and good afternoon. I, Mahima Kapoor, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend a warm welcome to you all to the IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we have gathered for a lecture on the right to development and sustainable development, reflections on global and South Asian developments by Dr. Shyami Puvimanasinghe. This discussion is being organized by the Center for Human Dignity and Development at IMPRI and Center for Development, Communication and Studies, CDECS, Jaipur. I feel privileged to introduce the moderator for the session, Professor Sunil Ray. Sir has served as the director of A.N. Sinha Institute of Social Studies, Patna. Prior to that, he was professor of economics at the Institute of Development Studies, Jaipur, and has taught at National Institute of Rural Development, Hyderabad, Institute for Social and Economic Change, Bangalore, and was a visiting fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, Sussex, and Institute of Oriental Studies, Russia. He was awarded Senior Fellowship by Government of Germany at Max Weber Stiftung to work on alternative development paradigm. Professor Ray has 35 years of experience in research and teaching in the field of environmental economics, political economy of development, rural development, and institutional economics. He was part of the review mission team of the European Commission and has worked on several consulting assignments with the World Bank and other international organizations. His papers have been published extensively in reputed national and international journals. He has authored several books, including Industrial Growth and Protection in India, Natural Resources, Organization and Technology Linkages, Agricultural Services and the Poor, Management of Natural Resources, Institutions for Sustainable Livelihood, and Theorizing Cohesive Development and Alternative Paradigm. Presently, he is an advisor at CDECS and IMPRI. Welcome, sir. I am honored to introduce our eminent speaker for today, Dr. Shyami Puvimanasinghe. Ma'am is a Human Rights Officer at Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Geneva, Switzerland, where she supports the mandates on the right to development and on international cooperation. She previously served as a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Law, University of Colombo, Sri Lanka, where she taught several subjects, including environmental law and sustainable development. She has also worked with non-governmental organizations in Gaborone, Botswana, on ethics, law, HIV/AIDS, human rights, environment, and development. She is an attorney at law of the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka and holds a Bachelor of Law degree from University of Colombo, a Master of Law from Harvard Law School, USA, a postgraduate diploma in International Law and Organization for Development, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Development Studies from the International Institute of Social Studies, the Netherlands. Her publications include the book, Foreign Investment, Human Rights and the Environment, a Perspective from South Asia on the Role of Public International Law for Development, and several book chapters and journal articles, mostly in the area of sustainable development. They include publications on the right to development, international solidarity and cooperation, foreign investment, human rights, public interest litigation, and economic, social, and environmental justice, especially with reference to South Asia. We welcome you, ma'am. We are fortunate to have with us Dr. Jos Chathukulam, Dr. Gopal Krishna, and Professor H.S. Shailendra as the discussants for the session. Dr. Jos Chathukulam is the director at Center for Rural Management, Kottayam. Welcome, sir. Dr. Gopal Krishna is a fellow, International Research Group on Authoritarianism and Counter Strategies, Rosa, Luxemburg, Stiftung, Berlin, and guest fellow at Faculty of Law, Humboldt University, Berlin. We welcome you, sir. Professor H.S. Shailendra is a professor, Social Science Area at Institute of Rural Management, Anand, Gujarat. Welcome, sir. Now, I invite Professor Ray to take the proceedings further, and we look forward to learning from our esteemed gathering. Thank you.
Professor Ray, kindly unmute yourself. Professor Ray, you have to unmute yourself, sir. Bottom left. So bottom left, the mic sign. Yes.
Are you able to hear me? Are you able to hear me, Dr.
Yes,
Arjun?
we can hear you. Yes, we can.
Good. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mahima, for your nice introduction to every one of us. I also thank Dr. Arjun for giving me an opportunity to moderate such a nice discussion that is going to be ensued based on the presentation to be made by Dr. Swami. We are really fortunate that we are having this evening. Dr. Swami is an eminent writer, at the same time a superb intellectual and a thinker, especially from the developing countries like India. Actually, when I read her outline and also closely seen the title of our presentation, you could see very interestingly, very methodologically, she has explained that right to development and then comes sustainable development. That's something which is very much insightful in certain sense. Right to development and then comes sustainable development. What it means that if you really want development to sustain, ensure the right of the people to development. That is implied, that is what I understand. And if I understand her outlines, is something which is very important, relevant to the kind of a forum which Dr. Arjun has created at IMPRI. In fact, when I came out with my work on cohesive development as an alternative development paradigm, and also made a presentation in this forum, Dr. Arjun was quite intellectually stimulated and his team members as well. And they all felt that they need to have, under the leadership of Dr. Arjun, a kind of a forum where academicians, intellectuals, social scientists in general can come, explain, express a different point of view, different cosmovision, different worldview altogether, and different from and opposed to modern, what is called a dominant development paradigm. This is precisely what the objective of this forum is all about. It's not like any other thing that you go on describing, narrating, and then end up with a narration with a bit of implications here and there and making a policy approach. No. This forum says that, well, that is done. Now come out with something which is much more important. A new theoretical construction. Is it possible for us to conceive? How is it possible for us to escape, rather get rid of this, what is called dominant development paradigm, kind of a logic which have been invading the psyche of every one of us throughout the world, especially third world countries like India and Sri Lanka and so on and so forth. How to get out of it? Can we think something very alternative or different kind of a thing? This is the forum. This forum is exclusively meant to address such questions. It is precisely here I could see how that Dr. Swami's presentation, when I go in through her outlines, I could see that very importantly, she wants to see and open up. I mean, this is the 6th or 7th in the series, and all eminent scholars from all over the world have spoken here in this forum. This is the first time I could see, and each one I have moderated, but this is the first time I could see Dr. Swami's presentation is something different from, as I could presume that it's from looking at the things from the legal point of view, international law, and then talking about sustainable development, talking about the right to development and so on and so forth. And then she also very critical of what is called modern or dominant development paradigm, which originated in the West some 2 centuries ago. and have been invading throughout the world, have been running throughout the world now, even now, also through an more inspired through globalization. And then she says that if you really want to come out from this kind of thing, have a different alternative discourse of development, you certainly have to bank upon international solidarity. The solidarity, both at the international level, at the regional level. It means that what I have been working on cohesive development. Let me put it very simple way and one or two sentences. This is the thesis what I have developed, this cohesive development, which is basically dependent on solidarism. But solidarism is not in a vague terms, very categorical. Solidarism with one, it is the people who are deprived from all walks of life, social, political, religiously, racially, environmentally, and from all walks of life, the deprived people together need to have a cohesive solidarity amongst them and bring about what is called cohesive development. That is one thing, a forum. That is one thing, that idea or understanding that got crystallized over a period of time through the discussions and various presentations that I made. And I finally found that this is something which resonates at every corner of the world. May it be Latin American countries, may it be third world countries like Asian, South Asian countries like India. You find there is a huge what is called similarity of understanding or the objective material conditions that have been really, giving it it's a serious problem, creating a serious problem to the people for their survival. Now, not only ecological, not only poverty, inequality, that is what Dr. Shyami is talking about, going to talk about, but also ecological. Now, the challenge is how do you bring them together to have an integrated approach towards change, towards transformation, towards development, especially with the third world countries. I find, to begin with, is very exciting and very stimulating lecture that you are going to hear from Dr. Shyami, especially from the legal point of view, how it is to be justified by the international law. It's best talk, is it rhetoric or reality? It turns out to be much more rhetoric in many sense, but when it comes to reality, you find there's a huge gap between the reality and the rhetoric. That is something is a very serious problem. It's nice to hear about what the law is speaking about, but when it comes to practice, you find that there is a huge gap. How to really bridge this gap? Is it not the social movement that people have been waging against this kind of tyrannical system, which need to be welcomed at every point of time, both at the national level, at the international level? Well, this could be an issue for us to talk about and all that. But anyway, I leave it at that. But I must say that we have got very eminent panelists, very eminent, and each one has very serious academic credentials, not only at the field level, but also theoretical construction level. They have established their credibility. We are really very fortunate that we have very eminent panel of what is called eminent panelists, social scientists, and we'll be able to deliver on each and every issue and therefore develop an argument based on that. Ultimately, you see, where do you want to reach and how do you want to reach? That's something, the contribution of each one will be extraordinarily beneficial for this discussion. On the one hand, we have Dr. Gopal Krishna, who is an eminent, who is a tremendous exposure on what is called law, as I know all of them, law, and also at the same time, the social science. Law and social science he combines together, which is a unique combination that he has been doing for several years. Similarly, Professor Shailendra, he has been working both at the field as well as the theoretical level, which is extraordinarily beneficial, and most importantly, on theory of cooperation. And that has an implicit understanding on solidarism, which is something which is very important for us to take note of. At the same time, we have the Thomas, Jos Chathukulam. Dr. Jos has a very, very serious gaps over what is called the micro level situation at the Panchayat decentralization level, and how the development could be really further fostered, can be enhanced based on what is called cooperative, based on solidarity among the people together at the micro level, especially those who are being deprived all along. So we are very fortunate that we have got eminent scholars with us, along with the speakers, Dr. Shyami, who is all on. And I take this opportunity to begin with Dr. Arjun, later on may think about developing a forum at the South Asian level. Maybe that Dr. Swami may take this initiative, or at the initiative of Dr. Swami, that we can think about opening a forum at the what is called international level, especially these South Asian states, countries. Thank you so much. And with this, brief, what is called opening remarks, may I request Dr. Swami to speak, to enlighten us on the issues that she's going to talk about. Thank you so much. Dr. Swami.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, Dr. Arjun Kumar, Dr. Sunil Rai. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. Namaste, Ayubovan, Vanakkam. Let me start, as I said in my abstract, with a few reflections on what is the right to development. Now, the right to development, according to international law, makes development a human right. So it's not a generosity, it's not a luxury, it is a human right. And maybe I'll say a couple of words about human rights before going on to right to development, because I realize that, as I said in the abstract, development has traditionally been in the hands mostly of economists, and lawyers have been traditionally not so engaged in the field of development and development studies. But there is a long history, as excellently pointed out by Dr. Sunil Ray, that there is this development law, human rights law, environmental law, which is very much a part of our theory, but we still have to make a huge linkage with development in practice. So there is a lot of good human rights law, which could be very informative for development in theory as well as practice, but the connections have not been made as much as they could be to improve human life for the human being. Human rights basically look at the rights of all people everywhere in the world. Why? Simply by the fact that they are born human. Everybody is born with certain human rights, simply by the fact of being born a human being. And human rights looks more particularly at those who are poor, at those who are vulnerable, at those who are marginalized. So the more marginalized, poor, or vulnerable you are, the more human rights would come to your protection. Traditionally, human rights discourse again has been much more about civil and political rights. The average person has heard about, say, the right to freedom of expression or freedom of assembly, but water is also a human right. Food is also a human right. And for developing countries, like Dr. Ray just pointed out, the economic, social, cultural rights are even more important, or just as important, as the civil and political rights. And the aim of development should be to deliver all these human rights to all people. So with that, I'll go to the right development specifically, because that is the human right that I work on at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I'm here speaking in my personal capacity as an author, as a long-time researcher and writer on these issues, particularly on sustainable development. However, I do work for the office, and therefore I will also relate this presentation to my work at the office so that I cover both angles. So what is the right to development? Who are the rights holders and duty bearers of the right to development? The right to development exists in both international and regional laws. And finally, what is the connection between the right to development, human rights, and the 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals? So The right to development came about in 1986 in the Declaration on the Right to Development, which said it's an inalienable. Nobody can take it away from you, at least in theory. The problem is that it is taken away in practice. An inalienable human right by virtue of which every human person and all peoples, you see the individual aspect and the collective aspect, and particularly for example, South Asian societies or developing country societies, this collective angle becomes very important. If you look at the African concept of Ubuntu, it says, I am because we are. I cannot enjoy life or development or my rights alone. I am part of a larger community, a collective. So an inalienable human right by virtue of which every human person and all individuals are entitled to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized. So it is a bit idealistic. I don't say no. However, I think it's only if we have ideals, if we have dreams, if we have aims and goals and targets, that we can even begin to try and reach them. So there's the human person and all peoples. And there are three entitlements here to participate in. Everyone has the right to participate in development, to contribute to development, and to enjoy development. And again, you see that it's not talking just of economic development, to enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development, in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be realized for all people, fully realized for all people. So that's the essence of the right to development. A little bit of the history, I think maybe you know the history of the right to development. It came out of decolonization, because when countries like India, Sri Lanka attained independence in 1947, 1948, we got legally independence and political independence, but countries began to realize quite soon that we didn't have full economic independence in the global setup. So there are still up-to-date organizations which do not give a right to a voting right to developing countries, which are very much run by the world's most rich and powerful countries, which decide on many economic issues, which decide also for the rest. So a few decide for the rest. So the right to development came out of that struggle. It came out of a struggle for economic justice and global justice at that international level, but it also includes the national level. So it's also the duties of countries towards their own people. People-centered development. So the right to development principles and elements include that the human person is the central subject, participant, and beneficiary of development. Who should benefit from development? The people. Who should participate? The people. Who should be the center? The people. Human rights-based approach is part and parcel. You may have heard about the human rights-based approach more than you heard about the right to development, because it is often used at the country policy planning level, in some countries at least, to have development should be carried out in a manner in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized. That's the idea of the human rights-based approach at the national level. But it's not enough. It's very important at the national level, but at the international level, like Dr. Rai said, we need international cooperation and solidarity is very important. And now more than ever, with the COVID-19 crisis, which has also brought health crisis, social and economic crisis, financial crisis. Climate change was already there, and it's probably closely linked to the COVID-19 pandemic. So with all these crises, we need international cooperation and solidarity, as well as regional cooperation and solidarity. And I like the idea that Dr. Ray said that maybe we should do more regional cooperation and, work together more among the 8 South Asian countries. Active, free, and meaningful participation. All people have a right to actively, freely, and meaningfully participate in development. We talk of individuals and peoples because don't forget this right to development came out of a fight of nations, the fight of newly independent, formerly colonized nations for justice at the international level. In trade, in investment, in all these international global economic affairs. So non-discrimination is very important, especially in countries like ours. I think we have to stress this. Non-discrimination and equality are part of all human rights. And so it means no distinction as to race, sex, language, religion. I would add caste, the South Asian context, class, all of these things should not be discriminatory. Equity means fair distribution of the benefits of development. Traditionally, we have been going along with this idea of the trickle-down effect. So development happens and it is assumed that it will reach the people at the bottom, but we have seen, particularly in an era of globalization, that that does not happen. And that the people at the bottom, that the gap between the rich and the poor has got much greater in the last so many years, in the era of globalization, where you have global value chains and supply chains and all this, that the benefits of development do not often reach those who need it most. The right of self-determination and including sovereignty over natural wealth and resources is also very part, because this human right is a balance between the human rights of individuals and the human rights of peoples, as well as the opportunities of nations. And because of that, we talk also here in the right to development about self-determination and sovereignty over natural wealth and resources. We see, for example, in many developing countries, especially African countries, that African countries are probably the richest in terms of natural resources. They've got the gold and the copper and the silver and all these. But the way that the international system works, somehow the riches don't seem to reach the people in those countries. They are for the most part taken away from them. There are more principles of the right to development, such as that development should be comprehensive. We should eliminate all human rights violations. Peace, security, and disarmament are also part of the right to development. Article 7, I can refer you to the Declaration on the Right to Development, 1986. Article 7 talks about the importance of peace and security and disarmament. And equality of opportunity for development is a prerogative of both nations and individuals who make up nations. International cooperation goes to the very center or core of the right to development. So the duty, states have the duty to cooperate to create an enabling environment for development at all levels, national, local, and to eliminate obstacles to development. Some of these trading rules, for example, I think a good example is the vaccine issue, the whole global vaccine issue, which is depriving many people in poor countries of getting the COVID-19 vaccine. You must be very familiar with the fight by India and South Africa to get a waiver from the TRIPS agreement in this emergency. It's an emergency, it's a global crisis. Can we get a waiver from the usual rules of intellectual property rights in order to deliver the human rights of people? And that's been a long fight, and that struggle is still going on. The right to development calls for policies. The most important thing is that policies at all levels should be enabling of human-centered development, human dignity, rights and freedoms. Now, who have the rights? Individuals, peoples, meaning the entire population, because there are some issues, for example, this vaccine issue or this trade issue, which in the COVID crisis, one thing that has become obvious is that there are inequalities both between and within countries. And this inequalities among countries has become very obvious and has been exposed and exacerbated in the COVID-19 crisis. Then, of course, vulnerable groups like children, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, all of these peoples have have to have a special focus, a special attention when it comes to the right to development. But it's not only the governments, it's everyone has a duty. The right to development is set in a way that we all have duties to fulfill the right to development and to help others to fulfill their right to development. If I take you back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 1 says all human beings are born equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and need to act towards each other with a spirit of brotherhood or spirit of solidarity, one could say. So all human beings, our actions have certain consequences on the human rights, on environment, and need to be taken into account. The right to development has three particular levels of duties. One is the national level, of course, like all human rights, so national policies, programs internally. Internationally, through policies extending beyond their jurisdiction. So, for instance, country A can do something like give subsidies to its farmers that affects the farmers of country B. So, extraterritorial impacts. And the third one is collectively through global and regional. So the United Nations and all global and regional organizations are really organizations of member states acting collectively. And so when they act collectively also, they have duties under the right to development. Now, I will go then from the right to development, I'll make the transition to sustainable development. I think this is probably a much better, well-known concept to everyone because we have now the 2030 agenda, the sustainable development goals, and we have the 17 goals together with 169 targets as well as indicators. One thing that we should point out when we are looking at the right to development and sustainable development together is that to make implementing the sustainable development goals, human rights are key. That is already there in the agenda itself. It says that it is anchored in international law. It is anchored in human rights law. Etc. So if it is, but this is often overlooked because this is not a familiar terrain. It is not a familiar area for governments, for policymakers and others who are making policies at the national or local or international level. Somehow human rights law and international law is a bit alien or a bit distant to their everyday work. It's been more the economic and policy planning work. And I think we have to make these connections. We have to bring these things all closer together in the era of sustainable development, where we can no longer talk of economic development only. Sustainable development brings together the three dimensions of economic, social, and environmental. And the right to development in connection to that. It links already, it has linked way back in 1986 and going back to a fight which started in the 1950s and 60s by African countries. It was really African countries who started the argument for the right to development, saying that the global system was unfair and needed to be more fair towards the poorer countries, the newly independent countries. And so in the African continent, under the Article 22 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the right to development is legally binding. Under the declaration, it is only a declaration, the United Nations Declaration. So one can argue whether it's legally binding or not. That takes us into more issues. But sustainable development, as you probably are familiar with, one of the most popular definitions of it, which was in 1987, the Gro Harlem Brundtland, or the World Commission on Environment and Development, which said, it is development that meets the needs of present generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That is still pretty much the definition, although we have the 2030 Agenda, Sustainable Development Goals, spelling out a more policy framework and operational framework. In 2015, we had all these developments, which are very important for development going forward. There is a 2030 Agenda and SDGs, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on financing for development. Without financing for development, many developing countries will not be able to go forward in development, especially now with the COVID crisis, which has, I mean, we know that the SDGs were already somewhat off track, but with the COVID and the related financial and economic crisis, they have gone further off track. And one of the main ways from the Secretary General of the United Nations and everyone, our High Commissioner for Human Rights, have been talking about this need, the need of the hour is international cooperation and solidarity. We have to find ways to live and let live. We have to find ways of, sharing resources. Now, India, for example, your country shared the vaccine. I can say in a very personal way, my mom got the vaccine in Sri Lanka because India shared the vaccine with the countries in the neighborhood until, of course, India, unfortunately, and I'm very sorry for that, went into a deep crisis. And I wish that you will, soon be coming out of that crisis. But this is the way, I mean, the only way to live and to survive as a humanity in this very difficult age of climate change and many other crises, the pandemic, is to help each other as well in a very simple way. And I would also like to read just a line which again shows the connections between India, Sri Lanka, and our South Asian heritage. This is the idea of sustainable development, but going back to 247 to 300 and 200 and many years before Christ. It was a story where the king Devanampiyatissa, an ancient king in Sri Lanka, was hunting. He was hunting in the forest when Arahat Mahinda, who was the son of the Emperor Asoka of India, who brought Buddhism to Sri Lanka, preached to him a sermon which converted him to Buddhism, the basic principles of which are simplicity in living, equilibrium, moderation, and the middle path. And I think sustainable development requires this moderation in living, not overstepping nature's limits. We have already been destroying the environment, and we really have, I think we need a change of lifestyle to both preserve what's left of the environment and ecosphere, as well as fellow human beings, as well as other species. So the word says, "O great king, the birds of the air and the bees have an equal right to live as thou. The land belongs to the people and all living beings. Thou art only the guardian of it." So the idea being that government and governance is a duty, not a right in itself. It's a duty, and governments and governance, whether it's from the most local level to the most international, is the idea of stewardship, of looking after public resources for the benefit of all people. And that they have a trust, a sacred public trust, to look after the environment and human beings, and that the king had no special right. The king had an equal right to the birds and the bees. This is what was said. And this was actually brought up again in the International Court of Justice. We had the vice president at the time was Sri Lankan, Professor Veeramantri, you may have heard of him, or Judge Veeramantri, he died a few years ago. He showed in a case called Hungary versus Slovakia, he brought all these ancient notions of sustainable development in China, in India, in small countries like ours, in Egypt, in the ancient civilizations, where people were living very sustainably. And we have now gone very far from that. How do we even start to go back to that kind of sustainability? And in a way, COVID has opened our eyes to the unsustainability of present lifestyles, and globalization will have to be done in a different way. We will have to do more locally, perhaps. Local development, self-sufficiency could be something that we think about. So a little bit more on sustainable development, public interest litigation in South Asia before how am I on time? Am I already overstepped my time?
No, ma'am, please go ahead.
Sure. So
Yes.
a few minutes more only. Following the very unfortunate tragedy of Bhopal in 1983, I think 83 December it was, or 84. We saw that the legal system could not cope with such a big tragedy where many people die, the environment is destroyed, and then there were all these issues because you are not having, it's not just a local issue, but a transnational issue. You have the local subsidiary of Union Carbide India Limited in Madhya Pradesh, no, in Bhopal. So I think that was an eye-opener in the region and in India, that the law also had to find solutions for issues like this, and issues of development versus human rights versus the environment. And with that was started in 1991, you had the case of Suresh Kumar versus the Union of India, I think, where people started bringing cases in the public interest, not just my interest, because normally in the law, you have to be an affected person to bring a case. But the idea of public interest litigation started in the 1980s and 1990s in India, and it spread to the region. So we have already had this kind of cooperation and this kind of thing of sharing good practices. So it was from the Indian Supreme Court, from justices like Krishna Iyer and Bhavati at that time, that some of the greatest judgments came. I remember the case of Municipal Council versus Ratlam Municipality, where the Supreme Court judge said, if people are living in subhuman conditions, this is like sometimes the third world humanscape of population, poverty, pollution, all in one place, and people are living in subhuman conditions, what he said is, build toilets. And how do you do this? Because by enforcing certain duties of government. We have in administrative law, we have mandates coming from ancient Latin term, certiorari, meaning you cancel the action of a government, or mandamus, you make a government or local government do its duties. So it's the judge said, build drains, build toilets. These are the work of the municipal council, right? But sometimes the law can be useful when there is governmental neglect or governmental mismanagement, which is again a very typical of many countries, especially poorer countries, corruption, etc. Sometimes legal tools can be useful, and not just by one person coming and saying my rights were violated, but by a whole community. So public interest litigation has come through representative standing. So you have had lawyers, MC Mehta comes to mind most when it comes to environmental law in India, where he would bring a case in the public interest, not in his own interest, but say of all the people living in a particular area who were getting affected by pollution or some industry or whatever. So that then in Pakistan, we have similar cases, a grid station which was giving out some kind of some harmful thing to the people in the neighborhood. In Nepal, we had a similar lawyer Prakash Mani Sharma, who brought these cases against the Godavari, against the mines, which were polluting and destroying the beauty of nature in the Godavari Hills area. So that's Nepal. We have cases from Pakistan and in India, many cases. Then we have cases from Bangladesh, for example, on the breaking down of ships, the ship breaking industry, which is very hazardous for the people living around that area, and usually poor people who are affected by these things. In Sri Lanka also, we have several cases of this nature, and these were all actually a South Asian sustainable development jurisprudence, which was developed in the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. It is less known of now, I think, because we know that today things are also a bit different. There's sort of a democratic decay. There is a, not so many human rights in many countries are more on the decline. So it's not such a good time, but I think that these could still be used, public interest litigations for these kind of cases. In Sri Lanka, for example, we have the Pavala case, where there was enough phosphate in the North Central province to mine sustainably for the next 1,000 years. But this company came, a subsidiary of a global company, entered a joint venture agreement with the government. And it was quick fix, trying to mine all the phosphate now in 30 years. So there won't be any in future for future generations. And so in sustainability, we have to think of the future. We have to think of the rights, not only use everything now and finish it, but how do we sustain, conserve things for future generations? How do we think over time? And it doesn't always go with politics, because political leaders are thinking more of the next election or of this present reign. But so that's why others, law and in the public interest litigation sphere, apart from representative standing, there's class action, like many people who are affected by one problem, then get together and mobilize and bring a class action. So there's different kinds of public interest litigation, which I think is a very useful tool from the legal side of things to assert human rights. So in the Pavala case that I was telling you about, the Supreme Court managed to cancel the agreement. They said, no, this cannot go ahead. You need to first observe the processes under the National Environmental Act. You need to do an environmental impact assessment. At least observe the processes. So we've had many cases like that in Sri Lanka also, which have where the public interest citizens or people affected by something, like villagers in this case, many people were going to be displaced, 2,600 families, and even the local village, in our local setup, the villagers, the Buddhist monk in the temple, these are people who have an interest in the community aspect and the community well-being usually. So they all, the dairy farmers, they all got together and brought this case, and it was a success, and the project was brought to an end, at least at that point. So looking at all these things together, then how can I make some connections? I think the right to development is key to sustainable development, because it already has the human rights and development together. What it does not have so much is the environment. Why? Because the environmental discourse came about later, 1992 Rio Declaration on Right to on Environment and Development, and all the later developments. But I believe in the progressive development of international law, in the dynamism of things, in the fact that once that law is there, you have to interpret it in a dynamic way which works for the people. And therefore, I think that the right to development, as recognized actually in the 1992 Declaration on Environment and Development, Article 3 says, the right to development must be fulfilled to realize the equitably. The word equity is very important. Not just realize, but realize equitably the environmental and developmental needs of present and future generations. So it shows the connection between the right to development and sustainable development. And going forward now, we are in an era of the SDGs. SDGs must be implemented, but in a way that works for the people and for the environment. How do we do that? I think the answers are already there in the 2030 agenda. The agenda is anchored in international law and human rights law. And we are in a multidisciplinary setting. We need the economics, we need the laws, we need all the disciplines also to work together towards in a synergy. I know it is more easier to say than to do, because governments are not used to that. The finance ministry does its work, the environmental ministry does its work, and the same thing at the international level. The United Nations Environmental Program has its program, the Human Rights Program has its program. But I think going forward, there is also at the international level, you see some efforts at synergy, at looking at things in a more multidimensional and holistic manner. And let me stop there. Thank you.
Professor A, over to you. Sunil sir, can you hear us? You have to unmute yourself. Sunil sir, you have to unmute yourself. Bottom left. Yes.
Are you able to? Yeah. So, thank you, Dr. Swami. It's a very stimulating presentation. You have touched upon several issues, which perhaps to my mind, more of questions. It doesn't really provide answer the way it needs to be addressed and so on. I mean, it provokes somebody to think in a different way altogether. Now, I do not want to speak much on what you have spoken. Maybe at the end, in the concluding remarks, I may be able to speak a little bit on some of the issues that you have flagged up. But I now invite the eminent panelists to reflect on what Dr. Swami has spoken. Now, there are two levels at which you need to fix our mind. One is two contextual level. One is that the present international scenario and of course it's global order. Unfortunately, I was looking forward to hear something related to global order, but Swami did not speak on the global order. Leaving aside the global order is something which is untouched, talking about sustainable development, talking about right to development, and somehow I was feeling slightly confused about all that. But anyway, this is the issue, something which needs to be really talked about. People have spoken quite a bit on that. It's not that something which is untouched, but when you really talk about this at the international level, we need to really take into consideration the global system, global order. That is something which cannot be undone. Having said that, may I request Dr. Jos Chathukulam to reflect on what Dr. Swami has spoken about and contextualizing the whole thing, both at the micro level as well as the international or the macro level, something that could be very important for us to learn a few lessons from this kind of presentations. Professor Jos Chathukulam, please.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Audio is not working.
Yeah, dear respected moderator from Professor Sunil Ray and main speaker Shyami, Dr. Gopal Krishna and Professor Shailendra and their friends.
Sir, you will have to disconnect the other device or make its volume.
Just a minute.
Yes. Because it's echoing for all of us, two device.
Yeah, okay, fine, sorry. Yeah. See, Dr. Chami has made excellent reflections on the right to development and sustainable development in South Asia in the context of sustainable development goals. She did within the paradigm of multidisciplinary approach of critical development theory. Of course, she has a very powerful legal lens in the sense that she touched the jurisprudence at the national level, at the international level, the legal regime. An excellent manner she could do with that. My first comment is that our speaker may be more comfortable in academic domain, if she follows a Gandhi Kumarappa perspective to locate the issue of right to development and sustainable development. Very rightly, Dr. Shyami mentioned that there, right to development is the key to sustainable development. That is an underline, the major thesis she put forward. Yeah. She quotes a very powerful statement from Gandhi. From this I got from her abstract. The world has enough for everybody's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. Underline. The speaker is very clear that equitable distribution of natural resources and moderation in consumption is the answer. Underline. I feel the Gandhian economist J.C. Kumarappa, in his classical work on Economy of Permanence, talks widely on such matters. The speaker says, South Asia is one of the world's economically poorest regions. On the other side, she says, it is rich in non-economic terms, ecological,
Hello? Hello?
Jos sir, can you hear us?
There's a problem here. Hello?
Sunil sir, some connection related issue.
a link between a development and right to development and sustainable development. The framework of Gandhi Kumarappa is a harmonious blend of the so-called economic and non-economic factors. I could see the speaker is seriously searching for an alternative paradigm to accommodate the problems of, number one, the climate change, development versus environment and human rights. Number three, poverty. 4, pollution. 5, loss of biodiversity. Discriminate liberalization and urbanization. Again, I feel in Gandhi Kumarappa perspective, the issues can be properly placed in the political context of local arena and at the international arena. The speaker gives the contemporary realities of COVID-19 pandemic. Yes, COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the unfinished business of building social solidarity economy. Professor Sunil Ray has made an excellent presentation, an excellent paper on that, the social solidarity economy, decentralization, cooperativism, and self-management. Again, COVID-19 exposes several of the problems and offers an opportunity to revisit the unfinished reform projects in several countries, particularly in South Asian countries. An important lesson drawn from the COVID-19 pandemic has been how differentially states and regions reacted to it and took steps to protect its people from its effects. Scholars have already highlighted 3 facts exposed by the very pandemic. Number one, the type of state and regime rather than wealth or per capita income has been the critical factor behind the success or failure of countries ineffectively responding to the pandemic. I would like to say that their robust democratic states governed by constitutional morality and public legality provided to be successful, while those facing a crisis of democracy with the rise of messianic populism. And recently there was a beautiful article by Patrick Heller on messianic populism. And authoritarian strong men proved to be unprepared and incompetent in this most important duty of any government. This is what the number one I would like to say as far as the COVID has exposed things there. Number two, the related factor behind the successful state has been decentralized governance structures acting in partnership with the civil society. The pandemic also exposed underlying inequalities and shortfalls in democracies and the design of political regime. This is what I would like to say that this is actually the international regime, the situations of international order. This is applicable. Therefore, my submission is that democracy and decentralization is the answer if you want to properly connect with the development, the right to development and sustainable development. In the political economic context, it is applicable at different levels. It may be at the micro level, at the macro level, at the international economic order. This is the case. Therefore, democracy and decentralization, I would like to say that that is the answer. Thank you, fine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jos. Absolutely pertinent issues, very relevant. I would request Dr. Shyami to respond to his reflections, queries, or whatever it is. That will be good. And the next one, instead of what is called together, I think it will be better for you to react or to respond to each one's queries or reflections separately. Dr. Shyami.
I should.
Sir, shall we take all the suggestions together?
Yeah.
And then go
Together?
Yes, together.
You want together? Okay.
It will
okay,
save
that
time.
was fine.
Yes.
Okay, then may I now invite Dr. Shailendra, Professor Shailendra,